everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Simon Corby, Chair of the Department, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Behnken. So Brian is a professor in the department at Iowa State University, and he has taught with us since 2009. His area of expertise is African American and Mexican American history in particular, with an emphasis on civil rights activism and comparative race relations. He's the author of 3 books, the editor of 1 more, and the co-editor of a total of 5 others. He teaches a wide range of courses for us at Iowa State. He also teaches for the African and African American Studies program and the Latino Studies program. Among his many courses is one he co-teaches with one of our colleagues who's here tonight, Professor Jeremy Vest, a course which is about racial violence in Europe and the United States, and it includes a trip to Washington, D.C. for students, which is taught every other year, and the students have thoroughly enjoyed the course and the trip to Washington. But for tonight, Professor Behnken is going to keep his feet firmly on the ground by talking about the United States, and specifically, as you can see, Mexican Americans, law enforcement, and civil rights in the Southwest. Right.
Thank you, Simon. Yay. Thank you all for being here. Gentlemen, come on in. He's so teammate. You're thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure. I always like to tell the joke that you know, with history they don't let us out much, so it's always nice to to be out to be able to talk about our stuff. I just published this book back in December, so it's still somewhat hot off the presses, and it really is like the fulfillment. I was sort of doing the math. I started working on this project just a little over 15 years ago. I actually found the idea for the project when I was doing dissertation research, so it actually predates like the actual written dissertation and first book, but picked it up somewhat 15 years later. So to have this be the culmination of all that work feels really good. It feels really momentous. I didn't start. I don't have to figure out how to advance the slides here. I didn't start with Brown and Blue. I wrote 2 books on this subject. So the first came out in November of 2022. So just a little over 3 years ago. That was Borders of Violence and Justice. It basically looked at what I call the first 100 years. So 1835, which is in essence, sort of the establishment of, Anglo-American, as they would say in Texas, or white American rule, followed by the Mexican-American War and, other big events in what became the U.S. Southwest. And I make a couple of arguments in that book that I just want to highlight really quickly because they feed into Brown and Blue as well. Okay, good. So one of the arguments that I make is that really from the jump, white authorities fixated on the criminal justice system, and they fixated in particular on creating law enforcement bodies and jails and prisons. And that's basically in essence what you have with these different pictures. The top left is an early jail in Texas. The women there on the bottom, that's actually at the famous Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona. And then this is the Justice Office in Phoenix, Arizona. In fact, some of the legislation that, that the governments of the various Southwestern territory states, for Texas, first a republic, then a state, again, fixated on the justice system. So one of the things that I thought was interesting about Texas was even though Texas is coming into existence in this Revolutionary War, you might think that they might be focused in on like the legislature would want to do, I don't know, funding an army or, road service or whatever. Like the second thing they did was establish the criminal justice system. And one of the other things they did in that this is the first legislative cycle, was found the Texas Rangers, which became, one of the preeminent law enforcement bodies in the Southwest. So they're really fixated on criminal justice. On the other side of the sort area, if you will, on the other side of the fence is the community of Mexican origin people. And in this early period, it really is Mexicans and Mexican Americans. It's somewhat hard to discern. And in a lot of ways, it didn't necessarily matter. Like you could live as a Mexican person in the United States your entire life. It was never an issue. And basically be a Mexican living in the United States. So to say Mexicans, Mexican Americans, it's sort of one and the same. But one of the things that I found that I thought was really interesting was that Mexican origin people joined law enforcement. And I gave a talk on this subject. It was another Your Historians talk several years back. Some of you may remember that I talked about a guy named Fego Baca, who was one of these early law officers. And he's interesting in that he holds the distinction of having basically faced down a mob of approximately 80, a lynch mob, 80 angry white men, and lived to tell about it. So he becomes like this full kid hero. Disney actually does like a short TV series on him. So there are Mexican origin people in law enforcement. And for him, one of the things that I thought was interesting, he's not the only one that's like this, but for a number of Mexican American people, they see, like the reason he challenged those 80 cowboys is because they were lynching people. And he sees this problem and says, look, somebody's got to do something. The justice system isn't doing it. So I will step up and become a law officer to challenge the situation, which if you think about it, in a lot of ways is a very early type of civil rights strategy. One of the other unfortunate things that I deal with in that book is just the extreme amount of violence. And both of my books have like these fairly substantial trigger warnings because they're just soaked in blood in a lot of different ways. In the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, up to about 1920, there's just this period of extreme violence. So Mexican American folks call it La Matanza. They call the entire period, like it's not just in a single event. They call this entire period the massacre, the slaughter, because so many people were being killed under either questionable circumstances at the hands of law enforcement or by lynch mobs. Probably the worst example was a case in a small village in far southwest Texas called Porvenir. And that village, like the military rode out, separated 15 men and boys, which is pretty much all of the men and boys in the town, and summarily executed them. And in fact, they did that. I don't think I can go back because I don't know how to work this thing. The cover of my book has a picture of a dude, and that dude was who they said they were looking for. But really it was just a pretext to go out and murder people. So a lot of violence, a lot of ugliness, and that leads into this book. So this is the book we're here to talk about. There's a couple of things going on that I think are important, and there's a really good reason why I decided to write two books instead of one. First, if I wrote one, it would be way too thick. But they each like book is sort of thematically and obviously chronologically distinct, and so putting them into two different volumes made a lot of sense. What I found in the 20th century is that focus on civil rights activism, and in particular civil rights to challenge this problematic situation and to get reform, became like a real big impetus of the Mexican American community. So when we look at why there are two books and what changes from going from Borders of Violence and Justice to Brown and Blue, one of the things is the population. So you can't, here's the thing about a civil rights movement. You can't have, like, social movements are not made on small populations. And the Mexican origin population was relatively small up until the 1920s and 1930s. But you can see how it grows in this fairly significant way. And you might notice 1970 doesn't have the S after it. 1970 is the first official census where Latin American immigrants are counted. Up until then, these are just estimates, so it's what we think that population was like. But you have to have the population base to be able to have a movement, and that's one of the things we see in the 20th century. One of the other things that makes a lot of sense, I suppose, is the problematic nature of law enforcement in the criminal justice system, in particular, the way it abuses people, the way things like harassment and beating and murder, killing become just like commonplace. It's different than in borders of violence and justice, in that it's not necessarily like, you know, lynch mobs always going after people, but the level of violence is really extreme. So that's one thing. Obviously, in this period, and especially into the 40s and 50s, we have, from a variety of different ethno-racial communities in the United States, we have a focus on civil rights activism and protests and that sort of thing. And so Mexican origin people aren't any different in that regard, in saying, like, you know, how do we deal with the situation? Well, maybe civil rights and activism is one way to deal with it. And then the last thing that I want to emphasize, that I thought, you never know where you're gonna, like, where a book's gonna take you, right? I didn't necessarily know where this book was gonna go. And one of the things that I found over and over again was the conscientious focus on reform as a way of addressing policing issues. And in fact, repairing the overall sort of law enforcement climate, as well as the broader criminal justice system. If you think about civil rights activism and some of the things we maybe have seen in the past couple of decades, I mean, you might expect more, it's like outright opposition, we want to disband, we want to get rid of, or whatever. And I think one of the things that I found was really interesting was that Mexican origin people were really focused in on reform. Like, how do we fix it? Like, they didn't hate police. They didn't want to get rid of police. In fact, there were areas where they wanted more police. They just wanted better policing, and they wanted police to stop killing their people in, you know, in questionable circumstances. So how do you go about doing that? You go about doing it by focusing on reform. I mentioned violence. So the first chapter starts off with one of the more famous instances of violence, and that was an incident known as the Zoot Suit riots. We typically just focus on LA. I just want to emphasize that the Zoot Suit riots happened in multiple cities across the United States. But the LA one is a really good example of some of the things that I've been talking about, where you have, so there's a lot going on. I'm just going to say really, so there had been this focus that the local government and the police department had on basically fighting juvenile delinquency and gang activity. And that bleeds over in some ways into this Zoot Suit riot violence. But in some ways, part of that focus is on the clothing itself, right? So on the actual Zoot Suit. The Zoot Suit is this is part of a countercultural movement, and the Zoot Suit is like sort of the representation of how, like, I as an individual wearing one is different and distinct and unique from other people. But also that it's weird to think, but clothing does this in a lot of our history. If you think about it, it's in part the thing that is triggering the angry response from the local government and from law enforcement, because in a lot of ways, police see as somebody in a Zoot Suit and they automatically associate that person with crime and gang membership and juvenile delinquency. So when the Zoot Suit riots actually break out, we're still not really sure what happened, but what triggered it. But what ends up happening is white sailors begin going into Mexican portions of town in East LA especially, and basically beating up, stripping the clothes, cutting the hair, predominantly Mexican American young Zoot Suiters. They eventually just turn that anger onto any Mexican origin person. But the way this gets back to law enforcement is LAPD actually coordinates with the sailors and allows them to enter these parts of town while cordoning off those areas so that Mexican origin people can't flee. Even though it's white sailors that are doing most of the violence, the vast majority of people who are arrested are, of course, Mexican origin people. But one of the other things that I found that was really interesting, and I have not seen this anywhere else, so I felt like this was a pretty, like, oh, this is a really cool discovery, is there were a number of Mexican American young people who joined together to basically fight against these sailors to stop them. They purchased radios so they could listen in on the communication between the police and the sailors. They did things like, one of them reported that they would send out like decoys to draw the sailors in, and then when the sailors arrived, like 500 angry vatos would come out, and attack. So it wasn't necessarily so one-sided, I think, as sometimes our history, the history has said. But nonetheless, it's a really good example of how you can see what is in essence extra legal violence playing out in conjunction with one type of authority in the military, being allowed and coordinated with another type of authority, the LAPD, to do violence against Mexican origin people. One of the other things that I talk about that's important to this particular example is after this violence, there's like every kind of like investigation that you could think of. The city did investigations, the county did investigations, the state government did investigations. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, and it shows you how government a lot of times works, and especially works where communities of color are concerned and law enforcement is concerned. But just about every one of like the local government's reports was like, we need more police to deal with these issues and yada, yada, yada. Mind you, they had done studies that had shown that all the stuff they were worried about, like numbers of gangs and groups, like all of that stuff had dropped significantly, and they knew it. But they also knew that if you play this stuff up, you can get more funding for more police officers and that sort of thing. It was the state government's report that was basically like, y'all are wrong. Like, this is not how law enforcement is supposed to work. We really should be focusing in on what we do to help this community that's basically been aggrieved, as opposed to just forcing more police on East LA. But it's a good example, like all of these things all of these reports and investigations are bringing in leaders from across the state and leaders in the Mexican origin community who are themselves like doing advocacy and activism in sort of a investigative format, if that makes any sense. So there's that. One of the other big reforms that I thought was really interesting and really important is in the area of what in the criminal justice system are called in custodial situations, excuse me. Number that are really important. The one that's probably most important involves this guy, Ernesto Arturo Miranda. Miranda is today very well known for Miranda rights, the rights of the whole, like you have the right to remain silent and all of that sort of stuff come from his Supreme Court case. It's interesting to think that process is now a verbized form of Miranda's name. So to Mirandize someone is to read them their rights. Interestingly enough, other countries have adopted Miranda rights and they actually call them Miranda rights, which seems kind of unusual. But it's one of the things when I tell people, like, this is a case that most all of us, if you watch the Law and Order kind of thing, know about. But have you ever thought about the fact that it came from a Mexican American dude from Mesa, Arizona? What his case actually was, he was an unsavory character. I think that's the nicest way I can put it. He was actually arrested and charged with robbing, attempting to sexually assault several women, and actually sexually assaulting one. What happened in his trial, though, is that, and there had been an earlier case, I should say, involving another Mexican American man that did similar things. But what happened is throughout the trial, he kept saying things like, I'd really like to have advice of counsel. Like, I don't know if I should be answering these questions. And every time he was told, no, you can't do that. You don't actually have that right, or you can take care of that after the fact. And they even lied to him, like he was put on a lineup, and one of his victims she couldn't identify anybody, but they told him, yeah, she identified you, so you better fess up. And like one of the conclusions that his attorneys later on sort of put out there is, if he had had counsel, like that might not have happened if there's an attorney sitting in the room, but if it did, the attorney could have said, don't answer that question or don't respond to that. Instead, what he did is literally unburden himself and provide the rope to lead to his conviction. His case obviously goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's an interesting case for a lot of different reasons. The case that I mentioned before was called the Escobedo case. And that case was interesting because it was a very similar case. This was in Chicago. Escobedo, he had his attorney, he was like, I'd like to talk to my attorney. And they're like, you can't do that. And his attorney like literally walked by and saw him in there and was like, and they're like, yeah, no, he doesn't want to talk to you, even though he was right there. That case is a Sixth Amendment case. Miranda is Sixth Amendment, but really more Fifth Amendment, right? It's really more about rights of self-incrimination and all that sort of stuff. But the reason I emphasize this is those two cases, so Miranda basically overturns the Escobedo case, a case called Hernandez v. Texas. There are a number of other cases that are like really foundational to how the criminal justice system works and like basically getting people right. So the Hernandez case was about jury discrimination, and it literally outlaws jury discrimination for all Americans, but really for Mexican origin people. There are other cases that have to come along to make sure that right is realized for Black folks and that sort of thing. But really foundational cases that like Supreme Court cases that change how the justice system and how policing works for the entire country, right? So it's not just like some local thing going on and we fix that local problem. These are national, national level events. Where we're talking about protest and civil rights activism and that sort of thing, the Mexican origin community is one that develops a lot of different civil rights organizations. And like some of those civil rights organizations are involved in those cases that I just told you about, involved in some of the earlier stuff. But when we get to the late 1960s, we get kind of a new focus. It's less of a focus on like, let's use the courts and the law and that sort of thing, and let's be much more confrontational. And so we call the movement is called the Chicano movement. Think about it, and it's also oftentimes called the Brown Power movement. Think about it in those, like it's Black Power, but with Latino people, right, with Mexican American people. And one of the most important groups in that regard is a group called the Brown Berets, which was founded in LA originally in 1966. They started out as one group and then they morphed in 67 into the Brown Berets. And this is obviously a picture they took in 68. These are the four of the main founders. As far as I know, David Sanchez and Carlos Montes are actually still alive. So they're still alive and kicking. But they were quite upfront about our thing is going to be police. Like our first thing, like Carlos Montes said, like really the first thing we focused on was police harassment. And I found that to be really interesting because I've been writing and studying on this stuff for years. And like police would come into the picture every now and again, but it was usually like, oh, there's a protest and the police are there monitoring. Right, so that's how, or there was like the Zoot riot. So there was some stuff going on. The police were involved, but then that's sort of the extent of it. And let's get back to talking about like how we challenge, segregation in housing or voting rights or that sort of thing. And one of the things that I found when I got into this, was how much policing was central. Like dealing with policing problems was central to what Chicano activists were doing back in the day, and the Brown Berets are a really good example of that. One way you can see just how important it is with their 10-point program. I don't necessarily encourage you to read it all, but the highlighted yellow portions are the portions dealing with law enforcement and criminal justice issues. So a full 40% of their 10-point program is about policing stuff. And it's the single biggest like percentage. There's like some cultural stuff and some educational stuff and some voting stuff in there. So the policing part of their platform is the single biggest percentage of a single topic. The Brown Berets in LA were really important early on because in 1968 there were these massive protests where quite literally thousands of kids walked out of school to protest this type of racism and segregation that they experienced in an educational setting. Those things become known as the blowouts. And the LA Sheriff's Department and LAPD basically go in and crack heads. And so the Brown Berets step up to basically be the intermediaries between the police and these high school, like these teenagers. And they literally say, like, if the police come at the kids, you get in the way and let that crack on the skull, like you take that crack instead of a 16-year-old girl taking it or whoever the person might be. Like the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets spread across the country. There were Brown Berets in just about every major city and a whole bunch of small ones in between. But I focused just really briefly on the Albuquerque Brown Berets because Albuquerque they have, outside of California, they have probably the strongest and most important Brown Beret chapter. They decided to distinguish themselves a little bit by calling, they were originally called the Brown Berets, and then they decided to change and call themselves the Black Berets. So they're a slightly different name, but it's the same organization. And they're another good example of how you can have a group that is like from the start focused on policing issues. One of the other things that makes the Albuquerque Black Berets, I think, interesting is they're one of the few groups at the time that had like a police abolition perspective. They still worked with the police, they still engaged in reform efforts, but in their, I think they have a 13-point platform. In their platform, they literally talk about expelling the police out of, like out of the Chicano neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And a really good way to see how how they do activism, I suppose. It's also a really good way to see how problematic policing can sometimes be, is with the example of Antonio Cordova and Rito Canales. These two are prominent Black Beret members in Albuquerque. They had both had experience either with police, most all of these young men pictures that I've showed you, they had all had experience getting beaten up and harassed and that sort of thing. In the case of Canales, he actually has experience because he was in prison. So he had spent time at the penitentiary in Santa Fe. And what was going to happen in 1972 is they had given a number of speeches on problems in local police departments, problems in the carceral system and all that sort of stuff. They were scheduled to appear on a very popular like early morning sort of like USA
Talk show.
yeah, talk show, thank you. That's why you're here. And it was gonna be the kind of thing where if that got out, it was gonna be like just such huge publicity. And they get killed basically like 2 nights before. What happened with these guys is they were enticed by a guy named Tim Chapa. He was known just as Chapa at the time. For a long time, people thought he didn't exist. So there's this rumor that this guy Chapa was there, basically encouraged them to go rob it was a dynamite shed at a freeway construction site, and to rob this dynamite shed for whatever different reasons. I've heard now like 5 different reasons as to why they were going to do this. I'm not sure which one is the truth, but Chapa is a police informant who had been working with the Albuquerque Police Department. A number of like 9 officers in total from the Albuquerque Police, from the Bernalillo County Sheriffs, from the state police. They basically organized themselves in an unauthorized task force. Ordinarily in law enforcement, when you have that sort of cross-pollination between agencies, it would have like a really specific mandate for that task force. They just got together like with their hunting rifles and that sort of thing and staked out the construction site. And when these guys appeared, they basically yelled freeze. Canales was armed. He turned to shoot and they shot him dead. Even though he was dead, they later shot him more to like make sure that he was dead. Cordova fled and they shot him as he was running away. And they claimed that they did that because he was shooting at them, which was later proven not to be true. But so these guys are eliminated. It creates this huge firestorm in the state of New Mexico and in Albuquerque itself. As you might expect, the Black Berets are really upset. There's a lot of protests. There's a big government investigation. Basically, their killing gets excused. Like the government does this like blue ribbon task force, and they ultimately, the attorney general ultimately clears the officers of any wrongdoing and justifies their killing. But one of the things that I thought was like interesting, like how this stuff sometimes works, is after they are killed, the climate is so bad that the local police department, the local government, a lot of different activist organizations, a lot of organizations that aren't even involved in the Chicano movement, like white civic groups and that sort of thing, are like, we gotta do something because the climate is really bad. So one of the things that these types of killings oftentimes generate is the reform that people were hoping for. It is a unfortunate situation that a lot of times something bad has to happen for that reform to be generated. And I make the argument in the book that for people like this, the reform comes too late, but it nonetheless generates that kind of reform. And there are a number of different ways that you can see it. The way that one of the things that I like to talk about that I found really interesting in Albuquerque was they used this event, and there have been other events as well, to launch a police athletic league. So there are a lot of different reform strategies, measures, some of which are going on in Albuquerque as well. So for example, trying to train officers in spoken Spanish so there aren't language issues, cultural sensitivity stuff, psychological testing to try to get rid of officers that might have bias or prevent them from ever becoming officers. But then things like police athletic leagues, which are quite literally what they sound like. It is police officers going out into the community to train, to coach, to make like they did everything. Like ballet, they had a band, they did baseball and softball and karate. Like karate was all the rage at that particular time. So like they did everything. One of the things that I thought was interesting is that James McCraw, who runs the Albuquerque Urban Coalition, that is a coalition civil rights organization. They're the ones that actually ran the POW program for the city of Albuquerque. And they're pretty clear on like, it's for the benefit of these young people. Police oftentimes will try to do things a little bit differently. So for them and for the Nick Backus is the main officer that coordinates with the Albuquerque Urban Coalition. They're police officers, so they tend to see it in much more of a law enforcement kind of light. And you see that in the title, like the crime deterrent, when kids into sports. The whole idea is, yeah, you get kids into sports, but not for crime deterrent. It's actually to build trust between the community and law enforcement so that you can have healing after these awful incidents of violence occurred. And, you know, a lot of times police are like, yeah, no, we can make this into something else. But the thing that I like to emphasize, and the thing that I think is really important, is just how much this program was liked and appreciated. So like in its first year, I think there are 300 people, and the next year it's up to 700, and it goes up to like 1500. I have those numbers right here. I knew I was thinking about somewhere I had numbers, and it jumps to 1500 the following year. But it's not just that. Like these kids get involved, and they actually start winning stuff. Like they become like the girls softball team becomes the talk of the town. The track team, like they're winning medals and going to the state championships and that sort of thing. So it's interesting to think like this idea, and POW's an old idea, like POW goes back to New York City in like 1917 is when it originated. It's not just like, hey, I'm an officer and I'm gonna go like mentor a young person in football. Like they actually have teams that actually go out and win awards and become like really important in the city. One of the other things that I emphasize in Brown and Blue that I think is a really important point to make is so a lot of times if you read the histories of the Chicano movement, you'll see like, you know, the Chicano movement came to 1974, 1975. And that's true if you look at it in certain moments or whatever the activism is. If you look at law enforcement, the Chicano movement continues well into the 1980s. So it's much more long-lived than I think people recognize, but it also goes in different directions. So, and I'm going to tell you about two. One is in the area of gay rights. So I think many of us are probably aware that the Lavender movement and gay rights movement goes back before this period, but with the AIDS panic / crisis of the 1980s, there's a new emphasis on gay rights, primarily because the police were charged with dealing with the virus. So one of the things that happens, and we've seen this, like if you've seen a case where it's like somebody was suffering a mental health crisis and the police killed that person, a lot of times when there is a budget crisis, it is acceptable for cities to cut budgets to social services like medical care and to then shut those duties to law enforcement. And that's what happened in the 1980s. The economic climate in the late 70s and into the 80s was not good. Cities were cutting budgets in a lot of different ways. And so then when you have this, frankly, what is a medical emergency, the medical staff wasn't there. And so what local communities do is they say, let's have the police deal with it. And the problem with that is police, that's not what they do. It's not what they've been trained to do. And they end up treating it as a criminal justice issue. So what they end up doing is start targeting, in particular, gay men who are sex workers. In California, it's like bathhouse workers. And then in the case of Fred Pais is a really interesting guy in that he wanted to actually be a police officer. So he was a well-known leader in Houston. Had been on the Harris County Constables for a short stint, but he wanted to be a police officer. But that, like, at the time, for an out gay man, that just wasn't possible. And so what he starts to do is use his knowledge of policing to start investigating all of these different murders of gay men at the hands of law enforcement that basically went, they basically went uninvestigated and unpunished. He comes to that same fate. And so that's one of the things about cases like this, where you have somebody that probably in the perspective of law enforcement is sticking their nose in a place that they shouldn't be. But what's interesting about his case is the two police officers that kill him were responsible for the death of another gay man who Fred Pais was investigating. So they were directly sort of implicated, and the one officer that did the killing was backed up by the other officer that was there. When Fred Pais is killed, it generates this massive outcry, and you can sort of see that with this protest picture here. Unfortunately, it doesn't really, nothing ever really comes of his case. And yeah, there are other cases like his, but I digress. The other thing I was going to mention about the 1980s is just how much national politics is involved. So there's both in the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, there's a big focus on immigration reform. At the same time, there's an emphasis by the sort of revised David Duke KKK of monitoring undocumented immigrants. And they even do they have the Klan Border Watch program. And the federal government, they actually get tours of border facilities. And so in the eyes of activists, there's a very clear association between government and Klan, and in particular, presidential administration. So that sign that's partially obscured there says Reagan and Klan work hand in hand. And I think it's interesting for the Mexican origin community, because one of the things we see, in particular in California and Texas, are these massive protests where 10, 20, 25,000 people turn out. And it's African Americans, it's Mexican Americans, it's basically everybody. And for Black people, they're like, no, we've dealt with the Klan, we get it, we understand. And then also there's this joining of law enforcement, if you will, through the sort of immigration border patrol networks. And they're like, we get that part too. And it's this really great moment of coalition building. I'm gonna try to finish up just in the next few minutes, but you can read, there are a lot of different recent policing books. You can read a lot of these different policing books, and like mine, Chart the Long History, which I think is really important. It shows you how racism becomes institutionalized and systemic in law enforcement. You can read about how the civil rights movement is this really great heyday of reform and that sort of thing. But if you want to point a finger back at where the problems we have today originate from, it was from the 1994 Clinton crime law. Originally, Clinton crime bill, written at the time by some guy named Joe Biden, who worked with the police officers union to write this thing. Clinton and a crime bill do a couple of things that are important in general, important for my book, important for the stuff that I'm telling you about. The big thing that the bill does is it provides funding for the hiring of upwards of 200,000 new police officers. So local jurisdictions basically put in grant proposals, and then the federal government says, yeah, we'll fund you with this amount of money so you can hire 23 new officers. That actually was
a program that Clinton had started as a Justice Department program the year before. So in the Justice Department program, that's 100,000 officers. Then you get this bill, it's 200,000 more. So the estimate is like it's just shy of 300,000 new police officers that hit the streets in the 1990s. Three strikes rules, military equipment through 1033 program, but that's augmented in the Clinton crime law as well. New money for jails and prisons. So just about everything that you might think of, it's like, at least in my mind, in some ways the wrong direction to go as far as policing is concerned. The government's like, yeah, let's do that. That's what always works. The argument that I and others make is that this basically, like, we have a lot of police in the United States at the time in general. It floods cities and towns with new police officers. And the other thing that it does, though, is the law is in essence a solution looking for a problem. So crime rates had risen in the 70s and 80s, but they had been dropping in the 1990s, and they continue to drop precipitously after that. And we now have some of the lowest crime rates in American history ever. But they're like responding to a decade back problem with this law. So it doesn't actually fix anything. Clinton, if you hear Clinton talk about this, he loves to talk about how he reduced the crime rate, which isn't really true. There's not a lot of proof for that. He's also then responsible for some of the numbers of mass incarcerated people. He doesn't prefer to take credit for that one, but nonetheless, it's there. But the reason why this is a problem, and then you add to that, like I said, war on drugs and war on crime, it creates this situation that we're now in with this hyper militarized type of law enforcement that is fearful of the public, that sort of goes in guns blazing. And the case of Jose Guerrero is a really good example of that. So Jose Guerrero was killed by a Pima County task force of SWAT team in 2011. They were basically, there's a lot to this story. Basically, his family was implicated in this like marijuana smuggling scheme, and they did search warrants and raids on several different family members' homes, including Jose's. Now, he's a late addition to that investigation. The problem is he's not involved in any criminal activity. He was a U.S. Marine. He worked at a mine. So the night they raided his home, or the morning I should say they raided his home, he had gotten home from an all-night shift and had just gone to bed. His wife woke him up to say somebody had passed by the back window and she didn't know who it was. He armed himself with it. He had an AR-15, so he armed himself. And then the police broke down the door, see him there with his gun, and shoot him 22 times. They actually shot 71 times. Later investigations call this whole raid like a fiasco and basically ridicule how it happened, because what happened was the officers said they thought he was shooting at them. What comes to find out is one of their buddies, as they were trying to breach the door, had basically tripped and fallen, and his gun had discharged. It had hit part of the wall there, and so there was splintering wood, and so the other officers thought that was Jose shooting at them. As it turned out, he never fired a shot, and in fact, after he was dead, they found his gun's safety was still on. So he practiced in the military what's known as trigger discipline, and they did not. This case is really, really big, and part of the reason why it's big and why it's important is because the sheriff at the time, his name is Charles Dupnick. The sheriff is really a good example of sort of what seems like the remnants of 19th century frontier justice still at work in Arizona at the time. So not only did they kill this guy and like killed him good, he goes on to gloat about it after the fact and basically talks about how his office and he himself are like the lone bulwark against these drug runners and gang members and all of that sort of stuff. Subsequent investigations, of course, come to determine that Jose Guerrero was a good guy. He'd done nothing wrong. He was not involved in this marijuana smuggling scheme. The other members of the family that were investigated evidently were involved, but they were involved, like their drug smuggling scheme was so minor that they get like the ringleader is the dad. His name is Alejandro, and he gets 180-day weekends off jail sentence for this awful, awesome drug running scheme, right? So it's so bad they have to kill this guy, and then later on, like I'm serious, like they do jail sometimes where you can go home over the weekend, so you get 180-day sentence. But it's a really good example of like why we have this problem with hyper militarized law enforcement. Law enforcement oftentimes is trained to see the public as the enemy. And so they had visualized this guy as an enemy, and as a drug runner. And potentially as a military person, somebody had access to weapons and was knowledgeable on how to use them. When we have things like the war on crime and the war on drugs, if those are wars and the police are doing the battle, then who is the enemy in that warfare? The public is the enemy. And that's what happens when you have this hyper militarized situation. It's what happens when you have police getting access to military, like they rolled up on the scene in one of those armored personnel carriers with weapons they had gotten from the government. And it's just a really great example of where we're at today. So just to conclude, I've gotten to the point where I'm not sure what the good of this telling you all this stuff is if I don't prognosticate on some ideas that might help to deal with the situation. I have a code at the end of the book that talks about a variety of different things. But I call it the last section, I call dreaming big. And I'm like, let's dream big on the things that we might do to fix the situation. I sort of just gave you one. So there's been some emphasis amongst criminal justice studies scholars and some law enforcement as well to try to shift police training away from what is known as the warrior model and towards what is called the guardian model. And what's interesting to me about that is the guardian model really comes out of the civil rights era. It's one where the police officer is more of a social servant to the public and not like somebody who sees the public as the enemy. So train police to see like people are not the enemy. We're not there to do you harm. You don't have to be afraid. And in fact, a lot of times, well, most of the time, 90% of calls to police are for aid, right? So we're asking for help. We don't need to be killed. These next two, obviously, is going to take some serious legislative action. But if we want to deal with some of the problems that we've had and how we have like this massive prison population and whatnot, we can get rid of the war on crime, which will never. And none of these things have ever worked, mind you, right? They haven't worked. They were designed in and of like the war on drugs. Nixon was literally like, yeah, we did this to punish leftist white people and black people. Like they were literally clear on why they were doing it, and it's rooted in racism. So it hasn't worked. It's caused destruction in the country and elsewhere. So let's do away with that. Let's do away with the 1033 program. Most officers don't need the kind of hardware that comes with that, so it's somewhat unneeded. I think we should probably think about getting rid of what's known as the objectively reasonable standard and qualified immunity. These are both like I'll just call them both right now like get out of jail free cards if law enforcement does something wrong. So objectively reasonable usually is summed up with something like I fear for my life. And an everyday person who's presented with those scenarios, they would have a similar similar reaction, and so that's how we can justify letting you off the hook. Qualified immunity basically saves law officers from civil action. One of the things I didn't talk about, but it's been a real big issue over the past, like since the 1980s, 1990s, is what's known as broken windows policing. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's law enforcement constantly looking for problems. As I indicated with the idea of a guardian model, maybe move away from looking for problems and look instead to help. And then for the Mexican origin community, papers, please policing has been around since the 1960s. I think most of us are probably aware from Arizona's SB 1077 law from a number of years back. It's literally the police have the right to racially profile you if you look like Latino and ask for your identification. And it's one of the things that's caused a lot of problems as well. So I think anytime you have legally authorized racial profiling, it's not a good thing, so we should probably get rid of that. And that, I'm gonna stop. And I'm happy to entertain any comments or questions. Paul, what?
Thanks, Brian. I've got two questions, one about recruitment, police recruitment, and one about Miranda.
Yep.
So I did notice on that last set of proposals, you did include recruiting more police of Mexican origin. But more broadly, do you have any stats, citywide or statewide, of the proportion of officers from that background? Do you notice a time when it starts to increase? And is there a point in time when there's active recruitment of, being, I mean, those 300,000 police in the 1990s, it'd be interesting to see how many of them were actually Mexican or, origin.
Yeah.
And then secondly, was that picture you had on the Miranda slide, was that of Miranda himself?
Yeah.
Okay, so, you Americans screw around with how you do dates, months and days, the day always comes first, right? But I believe that was April 67, and the case was in 66. So was this him being arrested with the mugshot after that Supreme Court case?
Yeah.
And what do you know subsequently about him?
Yeah. So what happened, which happens in a lot of cases, actually the Hernandez case that I mentioned is the same way. So the Supreme Court is like this, you did this wrong. And so you have to, if the local government, state authorities decide to, you have to do it again. And so that was his second trial. And so, yeah, he was, and in that particular case, so he was Mirandized. And in that particular case, what ended up happening, because the actual evidence was, the evidence from the original case was quite literally the fictitious, we told you she identified you and she didn't. Obviously they can't use that in the subsequent case. He had evidently bragged or talked to his girlfriend at the time about those crimes. And so she testifies against him and he is convicted. So that's why it looks like that. Interestingly enough, after he gets out of jail, he primarily can't find a job. So he primarily makes his money by signing the Miranda cards of police officers for like $1 or $2. So you used to be able to get like an actual, so yeah, police have cards, at least they used to have cards so they know the words and read them correctly. And he would sign those, and you used to like, there was one on eBay that I was like, I should buy that, but it also felt really weird, icky, and I didn't, and now I can't find another one. But yeah, that. Now, as far as the recruitment question, it's a really good question, Paul, because in Borders of Violence and Justice, I have not just those, like a Fagabaka and a number of other officers, I have like a list of like firsts in a variety of communities, and then I do the same thing in brown and blue, because in some of those communities, the first went away and then they had to rehire. But in the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of communities that had like their first officer of Mexican ancestry. In a lot of cases, it was a really, really big deal, or that person kind of becomes like a celebrity in some ways. I read it by a guy in Houston, Raul Martinez, who's very much like that. He's incredible. But in particular, what you're talking about, so in the 60s, a lot of local governments, in the 60s and 70s, I should say, a lot of local governments adopt as a reform measure the type of recruitment you're talking about. And so they literally call it minority recruitment. And it's primarily for Black and brown officers, although anybody who's not white can benefit from that. I might add, this is where a number of departments hire their first women. So I have, for example, a picture of an officer in San Antonio, Laura Gomez, who was the first San Antonio police officer in late 1970, 78, 79. So there is a big hiring push as like one of these civil rights strategies. The argument that I make, and the argument that a lot of other scholars have made, is like, yeah, that's great. We want to have diverse police forces, but a lot of times the way police use those officers is as that salve for dealing with problems. So you can police in the Mexican side of town. When we have problems, we'll send this officer out, fill in the blank. And a lot of times they're doing a job that is fairly distinct in law enforcement. Like they are literally Mexican American police officers policing Mexican American people. A white officer would never have that. They would just be a police officer for everyone. The bigger problem is it's putting an enormous amount of weight on a relatively limited number of officers' shoulders to solve all these problems. And like they can't do it. It's unfair to expect them to. And a lot of cases when it doesn't work, then like minority hiring gets blamed. And it's like, but you started at a false premise thinking you could hire people of color and that communities of color would be like, great, everything's fixed and we can now get along, and then it doesn't work. And, you know, as far as now the more recent numbers, it is the case that in many of the Southwestern communities, like especially in major urban centers like LA and Houston, you know, you're talking significant portions of the population are police officers. So in most of those cities, like now white officers are the minority police officer population. Law enforcement for not just Mexican origin people, but for a lot of people. I mean, it's a good salary. It's interesting work. You know, a lot of people are drawn to law enforcement, and so it has benefits. Really, I mean, Paul, really the way you can see this though is go to the border. Like, so the border patrol today is like 65% Latino, if I remember the number right. It's incredible to think that the population that is policing the border to police Latin American immigrants is Latino, but that's the population that's there. Again, the money, the benefits, the job safety that come with it makes it a really lucrative position. And there's always been a tension between, depending on the generation, but American born Latino folks, Mexican Americans and Mexicans, right? So that may be part of that as well.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of following right on your last words there, I was wondering about the relationship between all these dynamics with a Mexican American community and then the border issue. You know, you mentioned at the beginning in your previous book, first the border is non-existent and then it's pretty porous. Here you only really mentioned border at this one point with the Reagan administration and a little interface there.
Yeah.
So I just, you know, can you talk a little bit more about, maybe first of all, in real general terms, when does a Mexican American, you know, identity solidify more in this sense that there was a time when people, you know, you were Mexican, you were American, you didn't think about so much that the absolute border until now, when obviously there's a huge issue about, you know, it is immigrants who are criminalized. It is, I guess, to some extent, maybe the native Mexican American community or Latino community less so. I don't even know, but just some more about that dynamic across the period.
All right, so you've made the somewhat cardinal sin of asking the question that's very broad, and then I will then spend 30 minutes trying to explain.
Give me a 3-minute.
I will try to be brief, absolutely. So I heard your question in several different parts, Mike, and so the one thing about like American identity, well, it's not the one thing. There's several things about that part of the question, right? So there have always been, even before, like there were Mexican people who joined the Texians, as they were called at the time, to foment rebellion, because they were like, we kind of like the way these guys are doing things better, and we see a better future there. And they identified with, in essence, what were Americans sort of in exile in Texas. So there's always been that portion, if you will, of the population that has identified with things American. But I read, as a friend of mine, Ben Johnson, he wrote a book called Revolution in Texas, and the subtitle is literally something along the lines of like how Mexicans became American. And it's a book about that violent period that I told you about in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And what he says in part, this is a simplification, but that violence actually triggers a unity amongst the population and a focus on trying to deal with that situation in a legislative way. So they had a guy named JT Canales, who was like the only Mexican-American legislator in the Texas legislature at the time, who basically did a huge investigation of all of that stuff. And what Ben Johnson basically argues is in bonding together and in using the mechanisms of the state, they were in essence arguing for the first time in a really bold and dramatic way, we're American citizens too. Now that may seem somewhat like, it's weird to think, I don't know if weird is the, so sometimes people have to, like, this case for African Americans is the civil rights movement, right? They had all the laws and rights they needed, right? The Constitution guaranteed rights. They didn't mean much. It didn't realize or become realized until after the civil rights movement, and in particular after the government does the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which literally guaranteed rights they already had. So it's like a redo, if you will. It's a similar kind of thing there, where it's, yeah, they had been American citizens all along in a lot of cases, but this is the time in which they are putting that out there as we have rights that we are not, they're not being respected, and we're American citizens. Now, I said there's a lot to this. A lot of the ways in which being American was thought of at the time was, in essence, being white. And so one of the things that they do to kind of make that case is make an argument that Mexican origin people are white people. And that gives them that sort of citizenship part of it, but also means they can't be segregated, or at least they hope they won't be segregated like white people, like Black people. So there's a whole lot to that. I didn't mention the border much here. It's frankly, it's much more important in Borders of Violence and Justice because it's so porous. Because we have, for example, vigilante groups and law enforcement illegally crossing the border to go and apprehend people. So and then you have Mexican authorities and this, and then like it's local authorities, but it's the federal government coming in to say, hey, federal government, we need you to investigate this as a diplomatic issue because this person has been killed in this way. By the time we get to brown and blue, the border is much more solidified, and so you can't have that back and forth. So in a way, like once it's there, you're sort of trapped on this side of it. It does make appearances periodically in the book. There's some big raids. So the thing that happened in Minneapolis, there's a very similar thing that happens in Douglas, Arizona. I mean, it's exactly that. Like there's a problem here. We're gonna send police in. We're gonna send the border patrol in, and we're gonna investigate and all of that sort of stuff, and arrest like little girls and little boys and that sort of thing. I guess that's a way of saying the border makes an appearance, but it's just not quite as important in this book as it is in the first one. Did that get it that well enough? I don't think that was 3 minutes, but
no, but you actually gave, I wanted to know sort of when does the, obviously amorphous it is, when does Mexican American become a very distinct thing? The answer to that, and I guess what I was really going for is, has the border been an issue all along and I just don't know about it, or is it really, obviously it's modern surge, and you're saying it's pretty much the modern surge.
Yeah.
There were problems, but it was more stable or not as central an issue to law enforcement.
Well, I mean,
for a long period of time. I don't want to be no.
But these are really good points because it's an issue when it becomes an issue.
Yeah.
So in part, one of the reasons why we have these immigration reforms that Carter and Reagan are doing is because the population is ticked up to such a degree. And so now we need to have like a reinforced border. So I remember as a boy in Texas seeing the first what are called aerostats floated, which are basically like blimps with all kinds of fancy radar equipment to monitor planes and people and that sort of thing. That's in 1980s, like that comes out of what's called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So yeah, the border is a big deal there. The problem in my mind is like, if you're from there, like you talk to people who actually live in the border region and there aren't like the problems that we think or that people in Washington DC think are there are not there. They're like I don't know what your problem is. The border's fine, we get along, And anything, if anything, the hardening of the border has made things worse for people there. And they don't get how we don't get. Like how you can have a Governor Reynolds talk about, we're going to go secure the border. And they're like, you're in Iowa. You don't even know what it's like here. We don't have the problems that you think we do, but that's what people think. Yeah. And I could keep going, but I'm gonna stop and let Jeremy.
Thanks for the talk, Brian, really interesting.
Thank you.
I was thinking about when you, first of all, you talk about the Clinton crime bill, and in that I see the sort of militarization of police beginning, and in my lived experience, it was post 9/11, right? The sort of massive, and during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, this influx of more military material. It had me thinking about both some of the things we teach in our class and your other book is like, the difference, what is the difference between police and the military? Like, because the other thing that's sort of contemporaneous is this notion of the National Guard being sent in to help with crime in our cities, and some of the counter arguments, they're not trained for that. But if we're making our police into military forces, are we, and then the border, sort of the stuff from your earlier book about, US Army is defending the border before there's a border patrol. The Texas Rangers are much more of a paramilitary organization than a policing organization a lot of the time. Like, so I guess my question is maybe a provocative request for you to sort of like think about or talk about, like, how much is the notion of policing and the notion of military defense sort of just completely bled together in maybe over the course of your second book, but also now, I guess, I'm offering a thesis for you to respond to.
So let me respond to that thesis then in a couple of different ways and say, one, good government never lets a crisis go to waste. So we know, for example, with 9/11, what happened, where the terrorists came from and that sort of thing. And yet what was the big focus? It was on the southwestern border. And that's where we get ICE, right? There was no ICE before 9/11, right? Do we need an ICE? Border Patrol works pretty effectively. They do a good job. There's a lot of those guys down there. And yet we create a whole new police organization. And that you can see that in the stuff that I'm writing about in a lot of different. One of the other things that happens with 9/11 is there's a massive immigration sweep that goes along with it, because it's one of those things that, like, where that moment of tension happens if you can get away. So that happens in LA after the Rodney King riots. That happens after the Zoot Suit riots. It happens in a lot of different cases. The city's in turmoil. There's all these problems, and the government's like, yeah, let's find a way to get rid of Mexicans. Like, and they do. So in a way, there's always like that connection, if you will, between the idea of we have to do something. Some of this goes back to Mike's question. Like, Mike, part of the answer to your question is that because we still have people coming, and this is a sociological concept called replenished ethnicity, that people who have been here for generations who happen to be of Mexican ancestry are in essence painted with the brush of being an immigrant, because new immigrants are kind of coming in. And to get back to your point, Jeremy, then those people have to be rounded up. The problem with that is if you look like a Mexican and you get rounded up, we've seen this recently where either it's been people who are legally authorized to be here who have gotten rounded up, or in some cases, and this is certainly more true in the past, where you actually have American citizens who get rounded up. Massive government programs in the New Deal to get rid of people. In the 50s with Operation Wetback is an example, where quite literally hundreds of thousands of people who are American citizens are being deported to a country that's not their country. So there's always that. The thing that I would, to go back to your question about policing and sort of those boundaries with like military state action and that sort of thing. So I guess I would caution on that, because like, yeah, that's policing, but where we're talking about like law enforcement and police departments, and for most of us, it's always going to be local, right? So that's not a big national thing. It's not a military. It's Ames PD, it's Story County Sheriffs. You go to your variety of different communities, and you're going to see similar. Now, you go to a major city and you're going to have school police and highway police and metro police, and like there's a gazillion different types of police officers, but those are still local police with usually with a distinct like focus. Like the focus of the county is one thing, the focus of Ames PD is something else. And so the military part, if you will, or the big like national part, that's a type of policing to a degree, But I would sort of separate that out between the sort of local level police department stuff. The problem again is when you get both of those things merging, which happens in a lot of these different cases. It happens, you know, in a lot of incidents where it's like the local police are actually being used by the border patrol to do part of their job, even though most of the time legally that's not supposed to happen, but there still is that sort of connection and collaboration. But even in the border, like you'll have the border patrol, you know, send in the National Guard, local law enforcement still doing what it always does. Does that get at your?
Yeah, I mean, but like ICE and the Border Patrol are national organizations that are militarized at this point, right?
Yeah.
So the sort of question of like, but I get your point as a local, that's important.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Denny gets it.
When were the Zoot Suit riots?
1942.
Two riots, I quickly.
I'm a historian and I'm not very good, I would say a bad word. I'm not very good at dates, but there are some dates that have stuck with me. You know.
So was the Navy approving of what the sailors were doing? It was official, basically, that the sailors would go in and harass.
Yeah. So then the Navy so the sailors collaborated with the police, but there are people that were like, we could stop this like yesterday if the brass would just lock the base down. And the leadership and the Navy leadership in the LA and in San Diego and other places as well, they simply refused to do that. So they could have stopped it just like that, but they chose to keep allowing the sailors off base. Yeah.
Right, is this a racialized notion of those men aren't serving? Is it connected to that, right? We've been taken from our families, we're being sent into harm's way. Like, and these ordinary folks, these Mexicans are not.
I'm sure that that's part of it, although one of the things we know about World War II is the number of Mexican origin people that serve is.
That doesn't mean the white sailors knew that or noticed that.
No, I think some of them probably did. Because they did not train in the segregated fashion, right, at that particular time. But no, it still goes back to that though, because like, so the Zoot Suit is a good example. The Zoot Suit uses fabric and textiles that were, like, these things are really expensive. They're expensive back in the day, they're expensive to, like, you still go get Zoot Suits. I've thought about it, I was like, it's probably wouldn't work, but I would really like one, but they're like $1,500, right? But they're part of the critique is that is material that could have gone to serve the war effort. And so in that way, you're being un-American by not doing your duty to support. And then when you add to it that sort of counterculture, we're different, we're like, they even have a different language, you know, all of that sort of stuff is for young people, like it's a sense of community pride and like it's in part like a quest for dignity and uniqueness. On the outside, though, it's taken in a totally different way. And so for the sailors, we think what probably actually set the thing off was probably some type of dispute with a sailor and a young Mexican American woman and jilted something or other and let's go out and beat up a bunch of men to show them who's really manly. But yeah, all that other into that too.
Well, thank you, Brian. Please.